What remains? I believed that every life could be measured in weight. Not in achievements or love, but in kilograms. My job at the Valhalla Estate Sorting Center was proof. Here, the lives of the deceased arrived in moving trucks, packed in worn cardboard boxes and wrapped in tired old blankets. They smelled of mothballs, dust, and the faint scent of being forgotten. Valhalla was not a solemn place. It was a cavernous warehouse, a purgatory for earthly possessions, where grandmotherly armchairs and porcelain tea sets awaited their final judgment. Landfill, charity shop, or smelter. I was one of the judges. I'd been doing this for 5 years, and my sensitivity had calloused over into a shell of pragmatism. I could dismantle a lifetime's worth of memories in under an hour, sorting precious keepsakes into the same bin as cheap, disposable junk. It was all just inventory. Everything changed on a Tuesday with the arrival of the Eleanor Vance estate. There was nothing remarkable in the manifest. Oak furniture, a dozen boxes of books, clothing, kitchenware. A standard life boxed up. But when I sliced the packing tape on the first box with my utility knife, an unusual chill spilled out, colder than the October air in the warehouse. It carried a faint, barely there scent of lavender and old paper. I set about my work, moving with practiced efficiency. Books in one bin, clothes in another. But I felt something was off. A heavy stillness settled over my workstation, thicker than usual. The distant clatter and hum of the warehouse seemed muffled, as if I were in a bubble of silence. Then I found the locket. It was in a small wooden jewelry box, tangled in a mess of cheap beads. It was made of tarnished silver, etched with delicate ivy. On instinct, I opened it. One side held a tiny portrait of a young man in a military uniform, his smile stiff. The other side was empty. The moment my thumb brushed over that empty space, an intense wave of melancholy washed over me. A grief so profound I had to catch my breath. It wasn't my emotion, but it churned in my chest as if it were. I snapped the locket shut and tossed it into the scrap metal bin, my heart hammering. Must be lack of sleep, I told myself. But it didn't stop. Later that day, while sorting through a stack of old linens, I heard it, a whisper, so faint it was almost nothing, like the skittering of dry leaves on concrete. I paused, listening. There was only the groan of the old building. I shook my head and went back to work. But there it was again, a little clearer this time. A woman's voice, thin as a spider's thread. Mine! I looked around. I was alone in the aisle. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast space. There was no reply. I tried to brush it off, but a cold unease began to prickle at the edges of my pragmatic mind. Over the next few days, the phenomena escalated. All of it centered around the Eleanor Vance estate. An oak rocking chair I'd set against the wall would be gently swaying when I turned back to it, as if someone had just risen from it. It would stop the instant I looked at it. A small, dusty music box popped open on its own and played 3 jarring notes of a lullaby before slamming shut. The whispers became more frequent. They were always at the edge of my hearing, fractured pieces of anguished words. Where did it go? Please, find. It was the voice of someone searching for something desperately. I started to dread working on Eleanor's things. They were no longer inanimate objects. They felt weighted with a presence, a sorrow that clung to them. The climax came on a Thursday evening. I had stayed late to finish the sort. The warehouse was mostly empty, and the silence amplified my tension. The whispers were almost constant now, a looping, miserable plea in my ear. Give him back to me. A bitter cold swept through the aisle, making the hair on my arms stand up. I looked up from a box of letters I was going through, and there, at the far end of the aisle, standing amongst the stacks of her own belongings, was a figure. It was a woman, hazy and translucent, her form shimmering under the fluorescent lights. She wore an old-fashioned nightgown, her white hair pinned in a neat bun. Her back was to me, her thin shoulders shaking with a silent sob. She was searching, her ethereal hands passing through her own belongings, ghosting over a porcelain vase, touching the spine of a book with a quiet desperation. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every instinct told me to run, but I was frozen by the tragic sight. This was not a malevolent specter. This was a soul in pain. This was Eleanor Vance. When I found my voice, it was only a whisper. "What are you looking for?" The figure stiffened. It turned slowly, and though its features were indistinct, I could sense a look of pure anguish. She had no eyes, but I felt her gaze lock onto my very soul. The whisper was in my mind now, clear and painful. "They took him. The locket, half of my heart." And then she was gone. I stood there, trembling, in the ringing silence. The locket clicked, the first object, the one I'd thrown in the scrap bin. With a sudden urgency, I scrambled to the metal bin. I dug through the tangle of tarnished brass and stainless steel, my fingers searching frantically. Finally, I felt the cool, familiar shape of the silver locket. Pulled it out, half of my heart. Her words echoed. I looked at the young soldier's picture, then at the empty space opposite it. She was missing something from it, the other half. I racked my brain, my thoughts a swirl of fear and adrenaline. What else had I processed from that jewelry box? The beads, a few brooches, and a small velvet-lined box. A keepsake box. I'd put it in the miscellaneous bin. I raced to that bin, appending the tiny artifacts of a life. Loose buttons, keys to forgotten locks, old stamps. I found the velvet box and flipped it open. Inside, underneath a couple of military service medals, was a tiny, folded photograph. I carefully unfolded it. It was a portrait of a young woman, her eyes sparkling and a radiant smile on her face. It was Eleanor. The photo was the perfect size to fit the empty side of the locket. With shaking hands, I lifted the tiny photograph and fit it into the empty groove. Clicked into place perfectly. I looked at the two young faces, now reunited after so many years, the soldier and his love. I snapped the locket closed. The small click echoed in the silent warehouse. Instantly, the air changed. The heavy coldness vanished, replaced by a neutral warmth. The whispers were gone. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was simply empty. A soft breeze, almost a sigh, brushed past my cheek, carrying a final, fading trace of lavender. In my head, I heard two final words, not as a desperate plea, but as a peaceful, grateful whisper. "Thank you." The next day, I came to work with the locket in my pocket. I walked past the scrap metal bin without a second glance. Instead, I placed the restored silver locket in a small, labeled bag and put it in the historical artifacts bin, where items were reviewed by museums or archivists. I returned to my workstation, where the last of Eleanor Vance's boxes were waiting. I picked up a photo album. This time, there was no sense of dread, only a quiet sense of respect. I no longer saw these things as inventory. They were the last chapters of stories, the remnants of lives lived and loves lost. And sometimes they just needed someone to listen. Discarded souvenirs. To Arthur, the back alleys of Boston's Beacon Hill were a treasure trove. He wasn't homeless. He had a small, neat apartment and a part-time job at a used bookstore. But he was a principled freegon, a modern-day archaeologist excavating the forgotten relics of a consumer society. It was a sin, he believed, to throw away things that still had life in them. Most days, he found salvageable chairs or good books. But one November evening, he found something different. It was sitting atop a mound of glossy black trash bags, outside a lavishly renovated brownstone. A small music box. Even in the dim glow of the street lamp, he could see it had once been a thing of beauty. Made from dark cherry wood, its lid was inlaid with mother-of-pearl in the shape of swooping swallows. It was old, the corners worn and the varnish cracked, but it had an unmistakable elegance. Who would throw something like this away? Arthur picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. He opened the lid carefully. Inside, the wine-red velvet lining was faded and frayed in spots. The little brass mechanism glinted, and a tiny porcelain ballerina, her tutu chipped, stood ready to twirl. He wound the small key on the underside and a melody began to play. But it wasn't a Strauss waltz or a piece by Mozart. The tune was strange, simple, and slightly out of key. It was a lullaby, but it was distorted, as if the gears inside had worn unevenly over the decades. The notes plinked out with a sad hesitation, filled with a melancholy Arthur couldn't place. He closed the lid, and the music stopped abruptly. Despite its strangeness, he couldn't leave it. It was too beautiful to be crushed in a garbage truck. He tucked it into his bag and took it home. In his apartment, under warm light, he cleaned the box, dusting away decades of grime. He placed it on his mantelpiece, a trophy from his nightly excavation. For a few days, that's all it was. But then the oddities began. First, it was the music. He would wake in the middle of the night, certain he'd heard the faint notes of that off-key lullaby, echoing from the living room. When he'd go to check, the box was always shut, silent. He wrote it off as his imagination, the ghost of the tune lingering in his mind. Then small objects started moving. A key not where he'd left it, a book flipped open to a different page. Minor things easy to dismiss, but the feeling of being watched grew. His apartment, his sanctuary, began to feel cohabited. A cold presence seemed to gather around the music box. One night, he was jolted awake by a distinct click. He opened his eyes. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting a silver bar across the floor. And there, on his bedside table, sat the music box, its lid open. The porcelain ballerina was slowly rotating, and that distorted lullaby filled the silent room, each note a tear. Arthur froze in terror. He was 100% certain he had left it on the mantel. There was no way it could have moved across the room and onto his nightstand. He stared at it, his heart pounding against his ribs. The melody played on and on, a ceaseless loop of sorrow. The nightmares started after that. He dreamed of a dim room, lit by an oil lamp. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn over the windows. He saw a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, lying in bed. She was pale and frail, her long blonde hair fanned out on the pillow. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing was shallow and ragged. And on the table beside her, the music box was open, playing that lullaby over and over. Arthur always woke with a profound sense of loss, as if he were grieving for someone he'd never known. Driven by fear and curiosity, Arthur examined the music box again. This time he found what he'd missed. Underneath the frayed velvet lining in the bottom, a tiny inscription was carved into the wood. "For my dearest Clara, 1891. Clara, 1891. The next day, instead of going to the bookstore, he went to the Boston Public Library archives. Armed with a name and a year, he began searching through the digitized records of old newspapers. Took hours, but he finally found it. An obituary from the Boston Herald, dated October 17, 1891. Clara Alcott, beloved and only daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alistair Alcott, passed away peacefully at her home after a long illness. She was 8 years old. Clara was a bright and cheerful girl who bore her illness with remarkable courage. She will be deeply missed. Services will be held privately. The notice was accompanied by a small etching of the girl. Even in the simple black and white, Arthur recognized her. It was the girl from his dreams. He kept digging and found another article, a society piece on the Alcott family from the year before, describing their wealth and lavish parties. It mentioned an extravagant birthday gift Mr. Alcott had given his daughter, a one-of-a-kind music box, custom-ordered from Switzerland. It all clicked into place. The music box wasn't haunted in the conventional sense. It was a memento, a vessel. Clara's spirit had attached itself to her last, most beloved possession, the thing that had brought her comfort in her final days. She wasn't malevolent. She was just lonely and scared, trying to hold on to the only thing she had left. Her presence wasn't an invasion. It was a plea. Don't take it away. That night, the activity was the most intense yet. The apartment was freezing, despite the heat being on. The lullaby played ceaselessly from the box, no longer just off-key, but a wailing, mournful cry. Arthur sat in his armchair, a blanket wrapped around him, too terrified to move. And then he saw her. She was standing in the doorway of his bedroom, a shimmering, translucent figure. She wore a white nightgown, and her blonde hair was a faint halo. She wasn't looking at him. Her sad eyes were fixed on the music box on the mantel. She looked so fragile and lost, a ghost imprisoned by her own love. She reached a trembling, transparent hand toward it, a gesture of infinite longing. Arthur's fear dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming wave of pity. This wasn't a monster. This was a lost child. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep the box, but he couldn't throw it out either, condemning her to search for it again. He stood up slowly. "It's yours," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "I won't take it, Clara." He carefully lifted the music box. Instantly, the air in the room felt a fraction warmer. The melody seemed to soften. The next day, Arthur looked up cemetery records. The Alcotts were buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery, a beautiful, peaceful place. He found the family plot under an old oak tree. There were large headstones for Alistair and his wife, and between them, a small, weathered stone, engraved, "Clara Alcott, our light." With a sense of ceremony, Arthur placed the music box on top of the small headstone, right over the carving of a sleeping lamb. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft breeze rustled the leaves, and Arthur heard, or perhaps felt, a sigh of relief. The faint, ghostly laughter of a child, happy and free. He stood there for a long time, then turned and walked away, not looking back. He didn't have to. He knew the lullaby was finally over. When he got home, his apartment was silent. The presence was gone. It was his again, and the emptiness had never felt so comforting. Arthur still went on his salvaging trips, but with a new caution. He had learned a vital lesson in the alleys of Boston. Some things are thrown away not because they're broken, but because they hold too much inside. The cleaner after the dead. Frank's job had a title, Biohazard Remediation Technician, but that was just a fancy euphemism. He called himself the cleaner. He cleaned up what was left after life ended badly. Suicides, unattended deaths, forgotten crime scenes. The police and coroners did their part. Frank came in after with buckets, chemicals, and a stomach of iron. For 10 years, he'd built a fortress in his mind. Each scene was just a job. The blood, the bodily fluids, the brain matter, it was all just proteins and lipids that needed to be sanitized. He had a process. He'd seal the windows, turn on an ozone generator to kill the smell, and suit up. He worked mechanically, detaching his emotions from the task as cleanly as he scraped biological matter from the floorboards. That detachment was his survival mechanism. It allowed him to return to his empty apartment, shower until his skin was raw, and eat dinner in front of the TV without seeing the ghosts of his day's work. But fortresses, no matter how carefully constructed, can crack. The first crack appeared at Mr. Gable's apartment. A standard unattended death. An old man had died in his floral print armchair, undiscovered for 3 weeks of a sweltering Philadelphia summer. The smell when Frank arrived was so thick the air felt solid. But it wasn't the smell that got to him. It was the loneliness. It was as thick as the death stench, clinging to the yellowed walls, coating the dusty porcelain figurines. Frank felt it, a profound, bottomless sadness, a sense of absolute forgottenness. He cleaned up what was left of Mr. Gable, but the feeling stuck to him. That night, in his own apartment, Frank felt a loneliness deeper than usual. He wrote it off as a professional hazard, but the sadness had a foreign weight to it. The second crack was a flat in Kensington. An overdose, maybe a homicide, the cops weren't sure. The victim was a kid in his 20s. The scene was chaotic, violent with rage and despair. This time, what followed Frank home wasn't sadness, but a cold, simmering anger. He started hearing noises in his apartment. The slam of a kitchen cabinet, though he knew they were closed. A faint scratching at the front door in the middle of the night. He told himself it was the old building settling, his mind playing tricks on him after long days. His detachment was failing. The emotions from the scenes were no longer staying behind when he zipped off his hazmat suit. They were bleeding into his life, mingling in his apartment into a toxic, spiritual soup. Mr. Gable's loneliness now had a bitter edge, colored by the young man's fury. Sometimes, sitting alone in the dark, he would feel a wave of utter despair wash over him, followed by a sudden, reasonless flash of anger. He started drinking more, just to quiet the whispers at the edge of his hearing. The fortress came down completely on a cold Tuesday in January. The call took him to a house in the suburbs, a neat two-story with a white picket fence. A murder-suicide. A father had shot his wife and 2 young children before turning the gun on himself in the living room. When Frank walked in, the silence of the house was deafening. It was heavy, saturated with tragedy. This wasn't the quiet passing of an old man or the angry outburst of an addict. This was the annihilation of a world. Children's toys were scattered on the floor. A crayon drawing of a smiling stick-figure family was taped to the refrigerator. He set to work, his body moving on autopilot while his mind screamed. But this time, he didn't just feel the emotions. He saw them. First, it was just a flicker of movement in his periphery as he was cleaning the master bedroom. He turned, nothing. Then, in the little boy's room, amongst the spaceship posters and plastic models, he heard a faint giggle. A happy, innocent sound so utterly wrong in the midst of the carnage. His heart seized. He backed slowly out of the room, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the sound had originated. When he went downstairs, they were there, waiting for him at the bottom of the staircase. They weren't bloody, vengeful specters. They were just shimmering, translucent outlines, afterimages of life. The woman in a floral dress, clutching a little girl to her side. The little boy standing beside her, his hand fisted in his mother's skirt. They just stood there, watching him with empty, sorrowful eyes. And standing apart from them, near the living room, was a tall, masculine shadow, vibrating with something that felt like regret and rage. Frank froze. His professional detachment was gone, leaving him raw and terrified. He could feel all of it, the mother's fear and confusion, the children's terror, the father's raging self-hatred. It swirled around him, a hurricane of emotion that threatened to tear him apart. Somehow he finished the job, his hands shaking, his mind numb with shock. He drove home in a daze, hoping, praying, that they would stay behind. They didn't. That night, his apartment became a stage. He didn't just hear noises anymore. He saw them. Mr. Gable, sitting in Frank's armchair, his face a mask of empty loneliness. The young man from Kensington, pacing the kitchen, clenching and unclenching his furious fists. And the family, they just stood in the hall, a silent, tragic tableau. They didn't threaten him. They simply were, their presence filling his apartment with their suffering. Frank realized the horrifying truth. He hadn't been leaving the emotions at the scenes. He'd been taking them home. He was like a psychic sponge, soaking up the final, traumatic reverberations of tragic lives. His apartment had become a halfway house for lost souls, and he was their unwilling warden. He turned on all the lights, but it didn't banish the shadows. He turned on the TV, but the canned laughter only made their silent misery more pronounced. He couldn't escape them. He was their anchor. In desperation, he began to speak to them. "I can't help you," he whispered into the crowded room. "I'm just the cleaner." The little boy from the suburban house took a step out of the hallway. He didn't look at Frank, but at an empty spot on the floor, where a toy might have once been. A single, transparent tear rolled down his shimmering cheek. And in that moment, Frank's last wall broke. 10 years of detachment, washed away by a single ghostly tear. For the first time, he didn't see the job. He saw the people. Their pain became his. He sat down on the floor and he wept. He wept for Mr. Gable, who died alone. He wept for the young man whose life was stolen. And he wept for the family destroyed by the one who should have been their protector. As he cried, a strange thing happened. The air in the apartment seemed to lighten. The weight of the sadness and anger began to lift. The figures began to fade. He realized his detachment was what had bound them. By refusing to acknowledge their pain, he had inadvertently trapped them. They didn't need an exorcist. They just needed a witness. Someone to feel their final agony and acknowledge that their lives and their deaths had mattered. He looked at the fading shapes. "Rest in peace," he said, and for the first time he meant it. One by one, they dissolved not into nothing but back into memory. At last, there was only silence. But it wasn't the empty, lonely silence from before. It was a peaceful silence. Frank didn't quit his job. Someone had to do it. But he changed. His process now included a new step. After the cleaning was done, after the biohazards were gone, he would stand in the clean space for a moment. He would take a moment to think of the person who had lived there. He would quietly acknowledge their life, their pain, and their passing. Then, and only then, would he pack up. And before he stepped through his own apartment door each night, he paused on the threshold. He took a deep breath, and as he exhaled, he consciously left the echoes of his work behind him. He let the ghosts lie where they belonged. His apartment was his sanctuary once more, quiet not because it was empty, but because it was at peace.